The term social cleavage will help us deal with this great diversity. In sociology and political science, analysts use this term basically to describe any division or line between people. Thus, there can be a religious cleavage between Protestants and Catholics, or Sunni and Shiite Muslims, a class cleavage between the lower, middle, and upper classes, as well as racial or ethnic cleavages. Indeed, in any society, there are nearly countless cleavages. They can be as fundamental as the gender cleavage between men and women, or as specific as an Ohio State-Michigan football fan cleavage. One of our key questions will be, which of these numerous cleavages in society becomes a political cleavage? In other words, which are politicized and become the lines of competition in politics? So let's turn to that question. Which identities become political? Remember, because politics is the realm in which communities make collective decisions about the public use of power, political identities will involve relationships concerning power among or between groups. This can have profound consequences, as we will see later in our other discussions. For now, we want to know which identities become politically salient. In other words, we're looking at political identity as a dependent variable and searching for the independent variables that politicize one identity or type of identity over others. There are a few different theoretical approaches to this question. The first is primordialism. To be primordial means to be the first in order, or the most important. It means very basic, ancient, fundamental, and primal. And that's the basic outlook of this approach. Identity, in terms of primordialism, is what you are born with, or what forms early in your life. This tends to be in terms of kinship and familial ties, based on heredity and early childhood socialization. This is somewhat our intuitive notion of identity, that it comes from the most basic aspects of who we are.
Primordialism is largely silent on the issue of how one identity becomes politically salient over the other. The argument for primordialists is that basic group identity, such as black or white or Jew or Muslim, is your political identity. It translates automatically into your political ideals and interests. One famous example of this line of thought is Samuel Huntington's Clash of Civilizations thesis. He divides the world into 9 civilizations, which you can see here on this world map. He argues that in the wake of the ideological battle between liberalism and communism in the 20th century, the main lines of conflict will be among these various civilizations in the 21st century. He argued that the differences between these cultures are so great that they are likely to lead to a rather constant state of conflict naturally and inevitably. But this argument has many limitations. First, the clash of civilizations means that there must be civilizations in reality, and moreover, they must really be quite unified in terms of their interests. But who exactly speaks for an entire civilization? Between the two of them, the Islamic and Western civilizations took up an enormous portion of that world map we just saw. When we think of the clash of civilizations between Islam and the West, we might race immediately to images of Al-Qaeda terrorists. But these are in reality a tiny group of extremists who do not share anything like the political identities and interests of most Muslims, any more than the extreme fundamentalist protesters pictured here from the Westboro Baptist Church speak for the entirety of North America and Europe. Moreover, the class of civilizations and primordialism in general tends to predict conflict way too much. In this view, people from different civilizations or of different primordial identities getting along should really be the exception to the rule. But in real life, serious conflict is the exception. Finally, most of the conflict we see in the real world happens between members of the same civilization, in the form of wars between neighboring states and civil wars. So this brings us to another paradigm that aspires to explain the politicization of some identities over others: instrumentalism. This is a rational choice theory, meaning that it looks at how individual political actors work to maximize utility, which is pretty much a fancy way of saying how they get what they want. These theories look at how political elites use identity as an instrument. Thus, a social cleavage is politicized when political leaders find it prudent to attempt to use these cleavages as a line of conflict. One paradigmatic example of this would be Hitler, who used notions of racial supremacy to justify his own totalitarian rule and horrific acts. This sort of theory has been relatively popular in comparative politics. One of its greatest proponents is Paul Brass, who has used it extensively to explain variations in conflict in India. He has argued that violence between the state's Hindu and Muslim religious communities tends to occur primarily where elites incite this violence as a means to their own ends. Another example of this logic comes from V.P. Gagnon, who offered a very interesting analysis of the wars in the Balkans between the Serbians and Croatians in the 1990s. while most popular accounts of the conflict, as they often do, told the story of primordial and ancient differences and insurmountable ethnic tensions, Gagnon provides evidence that Serbians and Croatians had actually managed to live in peace and were relatively integrated before the end of communism. He argued that at the time of great political change, the leaders of Serbia and Croatia, in an effort to stave off pressure for political change and liberalization that would threaten their own political positions, began a vicious effort to incite ethnic tensions between the groups. This effort was eventually so successful that it led to a war and a lot of tragic bloodshed. These accounts are often quite convincing, but instrumentalism also has limitations. The greatest is that not all incidences of violence between groups, or of political identities becoming salient, seem to involve much purposeful intervention from elites. Indeed, in some cases, political conflict or the politicization of a certain identity happens in spite of extensive efforts from elites to avoid it. So let's turn to the third and final major paradigm of identity politics, constructivism. As you can guess from that name, constructivists argue that identity is constructed. This means that individuals and groups are constantly changing and adapting their identities, and that identity formation is a highly fluid, subjective, multifaceted, and malleable process. This approach is thus very, very flexible, and because it sets very few limits on what constitutes an identity, or how an identity becomes politically or socially important, it can be used to explain a wide variety of different and interesting situations rather successfully. Another way to look at this is that constructivists see political identities largely as imagined communities. This is a term that a very influential scholar named Benedict Anderson coined. He refers to nations as imagined communities that developed along print media and industrialization. The notion of an imagined community is a very useful way to think about political identity, as it is a flexible concept that can account for the ways that people form connections based upon a variety of different identities, even across great distances. From a constructivist viewpoint, it is important to understand the collective memory of these imagined communities in order to understand their sense of belongingness to the group. What shared experiences and history are unique to the group and help contribute to its members? The term collective memory does not mean that people literally remember these events, as there are often distant wars and revolutions and things that didn't happen in a person's lifetime. For instance, parts of the American collective identity are likely the American Revolution, with things like Paul Revere's Ride, the struggle for women's suffrage, the civil rights movement, moments like Dr. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream speech, and some traumatic moments like the Kennedy assassination or 9/11. States also play an active role in contributing to these collective memories. Indeed, they encourage the process of nationalism and the development of cogent imagined communities because they wanted greater support, unity, and citizens that could easily communicate with one another to facilitate trade. Thus, states began a process of publicly educating their citizens, advocating for a shared language that everyone could read and write in, and instilling a sense of national belongingness with history lessons and symbols and rituals, such as the American Pledge of Allegiance. Finally, the collective memories of different groups can portray the same events quite differently. For instance, would you guess that an American and a Japanese high school history text would cover the end of the Second World War and the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the same way? They probably will cover it a bit differently, and this affects the American and Japanese self-perception and their collective memories. Constructivism clocks in somewhere in between primordialism and instrumentalism in terms of how identities are politicized. That is to say, constructivists do not see political identity as set and unchangeable as primordialists tend to, but they don't see it as quite as open to elite manipulation as many instrumentalist accounts suggest. Instead, they see the stuff of primordialism, those basic identities, as raw materials, and the elite manipulations from instrumentalism as part of the construction. Still, individuals and groups also play an important role in their own right, picking from among many different identities, emphasizing certain aspects of their culture or collective memory over others, and even adopting new identities as they see fit. Thus, the identity of any one person or group is highly fluid. Take the example of this French politician, Rachida Dati. Do you think that her political identity is primarily as a woman, as a member of the Conservative Party in Sarkozy's former cabinet, as a French citizen, a Muslim, or as a daughter of North African immigrants? Constructivists often point to the social context to explain how people identify themselves and which of those identities become politically salient. In the example of Rachida Dati, her political identity probably changes depending upon whether she is engaged in conversation with a fellow official of her political party, or in her capacity as a mother, or when she was asked to respond as a Muslim woman to the prolonged controversy over the French ban of the Muslim headscarf, or hijab, that the Sarkozy government she belonged to oversaw. The specific circumstances will affect the politicization of identities. As you can tell, this is an extremely versatile outlook. It takes some of the good aspects of the other approaches and provides a more realistic conceptualization of identity that is flexible enough to deal with such a complicated bundle of issues and can be applied to multiple real-world situations. This is probably why it has become the most widely used paradigm in comparative politics to explain identity politics. Still, it is very problematic as its flexibility translates into great complexity. With a notion of identity that is so fluid and subjective, it can be very hard to measure a specific identity, or the strength of an identity, in a way that is useful for scientific study. So now you know a little bit about the different approaches to the study of political identity. I hope this overview has given you a bit of a toolbox to employ when thinking about the politics of identity, as well as for examining your own political identity and how different circumstances affect your self-perception and group memory. Thank you for your attention.
Tell me, doctor, can you quantify? He just wants to know